Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar about the TN visa. My name is Hugues Plessis. I am a senior attorney at Scott Legal PC, and I'm joined today by my colleague, senior attorney Dustin Saldarriaga. Today, we're going to talk about the TN visa, which was created as part of a treaty between the US, Canada, and Mexico, which was called the NAFTA, now USMCA. The TN visa is really a great option for nationals of Canada and the US who want to work for a US employer in specific occupations, but we'll go over that a little bit later on. In this webinar, we'll go over the requirements for the TN, discuss strategy to prepare a strong TN application, and cover some of the frequent questions we get about this classification, including responsibility of employers and whether or not the TN requires sponsorship. Before we start, I just wanted to mention that this webinar is part of a series of webinars that we do at least once or twice a week on a variety of US immigration topics. These webinars are also recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. Our channel also has short form content that's really a great resource on a broad range of US immigration topics. As you may know, our firm does not only assist with US immigration or US business immigration matters, but also are available to help for family or humanitarian immigration questions too. I also wanted to mention that we have a lot of very good resource on our website, very useful, and we have a blog as well with articles. At Scott Legal PC, we pride ourselves in providing as much free information on US immigration as possible. If you need assistance, please do not hesitate to reach out or schedule a consultation on our website. After this webinar, you will also receive an email with today's presentation and a link to sign up for future webinars. I will monitor the chat and the Q&A as well, so if you want to ask questions, feel free. We'll probably tackle those questions at the end of the presentation. All right, now it's time for today's topic, TN visa. Dustin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Hugues, and thank you all for joining us for today's presentation on the TN visa. So as Hugues mentioned, the TN visa really is an outstanding option for nationals of Canada or Mexico who want to come to the US to fill a job that they've been offered. So let's start off by going through in more detail what the requirements for a TN visa are. So the first that you see on your screen is that you must be a citizen of Canada or Mexico. That does not mean you need to have been born there. You only need to have a passport from Canada or Mexico. And as Hugues mentioned, that's because the TN visa is rooted in NAFTA. And so it is a treaty between the US, Canada, and Mexico. You need to be coming to the US to fill a job that appears on a list of professions. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be referring to the NAFTA TN regulations. If you're at your computer, you can Google TN NAFTA, N-A-F-T-A, regulations, and you'll see once you pull up the link to the NAFTA regulations and scroll down, you'll see that the regulations actually list dozens of occupations. So we start with accountant, next is architect, moving on to computer systems analyst. And as you scroll, you see there are a variety of jobs: veterinarians, nutritionists, scientists, even teachers. So again, I'll be referring to these regulations throughout the presentation. So if you want to go ahead and pull them up now, that might be helpful to do. So you need to have a job offer from an employer in the US who's offering you a job in one of these listed professions. Now, you need to have the qualifications. Once you have selected which occupation you're going to be filling, you need to actually qualify for it. And when I say you need to qualify for it, I'm not referring to what the employer wants you to have, whether that's experience or certain education. What I mean is you need to qualify for the role based on the regulations themselves. So again, if we look at the NAFTA regulations, let's take the example of accountant, which is the first occupation on the list. You see after accountant, it says baccalaureate or licenciatura degree, or CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA. So we have two ways to qualify as an accountant. You either need to have a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree, or the other option is to have a professional license as an accountant. So for the accounting category, you cannot qualify for that category based on experience alone. If we scroll down the screen and look at management consultants, just to take a category that is in contrast to accountants, you see there are a variety of ways that you can qualify for the management consultant category. You see you can qualify based on a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree, or equivalent professional experience that is basically the equivalent to 5 years of experience either as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. So the management consulting category, you can qualify for based on experience alone. That's just one example. It is really important if you're trying to figure out on your own how you qualify. Step one is going to be figuring out what category you'll be filling in the US, and step two is making sure that you fulfill those qualifications. So as we go down our list here on these bullet points, I've mentioned already you do need to have a job offer. So you need to have a pre-arranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the United States. Now, fortunately, employer in the United States is pretty broadly defined. So this can be a corporation, an LLC, a sole proprietorship. What is important is that the US employer, first of all, have offered you a job. So part of the TN application, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a few slides, they actually need to give you a letter, which we refer to as a TN employer letter, that details how long they need you to work in the US for, up to 3 years, what your job duties are going to be. They need to be consistent with the job duties of your category, how much they're going to pay you, and why they need someone in this position. So this is where, even though the definition of a US employer is pretty broad, you nonetheless do still need to be prepared to explain why that employer needs someone in your position. So just to give you an example, if you are applying to be a lawyer for a US employer, and let's say that US employer is a sole proprietorship, it's a startup with one person, it may be difficult to convince a Customs and Border Protection officer that that company is prepared for someone to come to the US and work as an attorney. So you will, even though legally the employer definition is broad and technically you can apply as an accountant or a lawyer for really any US employer, you should anticipate a conversation with the government officer about why that employer is at a place where they actually need someone in your position to fill that job. And finally, I've also mentioned this already, I've hinted at it, but in the job you're coming to the US to do, you actually do need to perform the job duties of that job. So to give a pretty common example, people sometimes want to come to the US to work as basically a social media or a marketer for a company. Now, unfortunately, the TN regulations don't have a position for a marketer. So it is difficult to come to the US to perform marketing job duties on a TN. What people sometimes try to do is, if they say have an undergraduate degree in economics, they might apply for a TN in the economist category, but their job duties are those of a marketer. That's going to be a problem. And the reason is that when the government looks at the job category you're applying to come in for, so let's say it's an economist, what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, what are the job duties that an economist does? And then their next question is going to be, is this person going to be performing those job duties? So how do you know what the government thinks someone in a certain occupation does? They use a resource called the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So we call this the OOH for short. Again, if you're at your computer, it's probably helpful to just go ahead and Google now, OOH. Let's take accountant as an example. So OOH accountant, you see first result is accountants and auditors. If you click the tab at the top of that screen, once you follow that link, there's a tab that says what they do. When you click that, you actually see job duties. Examine financial statements, compute taxes owed, inspect account books, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to make sure that your job duties that you're actually going to perform in this job are aligned with what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says someone in that position does. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. One of the title of this presentation, and part of the reason we titled this presentation is Does the TN Require Sponsorship, is that this really is one of the most common questions that we get from both people who want to work as a TN employee and employers in the US that are interested in hiring someone as a TN employee. And the question is, does the TN require sponsorship? So to answer this question, it's first important to define what sponsorship is and what people usually mean when they use that term. Because the short answer that we would give is no, the TN does not require sponsorship. But it is important to flesh out what that means. The reason we say that the TN doesn't require sponsorship is that to us, the definition of sponsorship is what is usually meant when someone's talking about, say, the H-1B context or the employment-based green card context. So in those options, let's take the H-1B as an example, since it is another non-immigrant visa like the TN. If an employer wants to bring in an employee on an H-1B, then they need to pay a prevailing wage, as an example. A prevailing wage is going to almost always be higher than the minimum wage. Okay, they also need to ensure that the employee is actually working, that they're not benched. If the employee is terminated, in certain circumstances, they'll have to pay for that employee's transportation back to their home country. They may need to test the labor market. They may need to advertise the job and make sure that there are no other qualified U.S. workers before they hire the H-1B worker. In the TN context, none of that applies. So in the TN context, you do not first need to offer the job to U.S. workers. You do not need to first test the labor market to see if there are U.S. workers who want to do the job. You do not need to pay higher than the required minimum wage. So the TN actually places minimal additional requirements on the employer. And that's why we say it doesn't require sponsorship. So what does the employer have to do? What are the requirements? Basically, they are pretty much the same as they would be for any other at-will employee. So at-will employment is when the employee has the ability to quit whenever they want, and the employer has the ability to fire them, basically on almost any legal grounds. And so that's basically what you have in the TN context. The employer, we'll talk about this later, does need to provide, as I mentioned before, a letter that explains the details of the position, what they intend to pay the person, how long they intend to employ them. Usually that's a 3-year period. But that is not a binding contract that the government is going to step in and enforce. Okay, so in terms of what are the employer's obligations, it really is to make a legitimate and honest job offer to the employee, to put that job offer in writing in the form of the employer letter. And if, excuse me, if the individual is applying for a TN status from within the US, the employer would be the one signing the application that goes to USCIS. That's called the I-129. We'll talk about that in more detail later. But again, that doesn't create any additional, practically, it does not create any additional obligations on the employer. The employee is still an at-will employee. The employer can still choose to pay the employee what they want to, as long as it complies with minimum wage requirements. One quick note on pay, because I don't want anyone to think that an employer can simply pay minimum wage and not think about it again. Similar to showing that the employer has a real need for the job, the employer should be paying a wage that is normal of the given position. So if you're coming into the US to work as a lawyer, it is going to look very strange if you're being paid minimum wage, and that application will almost certainly be denied, right? You do want to show the government that the job offer is legitimate. And part of that is showing that the pay you'll be receiving to perform the job duties is what's normal for that role. So even though legally the employer doesn't have to pay a prevailing wage or anything higher than minimum wage, you do want to think through with the employer, what is a legitimate wage for this role. So let's talk about differences for Canadians and Mexicans who are applying for a TN. So as I mentioned before, you do need to be a national of either Canada or Mexico to qualify for a TN. But the process of applying is actually quite different for the two. And that's because Canadians actually have a very convenient option to apply for a TN at a port of entry. And that option is not available for nationals of Mexico. So Canadians, as I mentioned, they really have three primary options to apply for a TN. They can approach a port of entry, whether that's a land crossing, whether that's an airport, and they bring their application packet with them. I'll talk about what the application packet has in a few slides. But this could be, like I said, this could be Pearson Airport. This could be, a border crossing between Canada and the US. It could be a border crossing between Mexico and the US. And they would present their application to the border officer and say, I'm coming into the US to work for a US employer in TN status. And the Customs and Border Protection Officer will review their application. And if they're approved, will grant them TN status for 3 years. We'll grant them admission. They will typically be given TN status for 3 years, and they'll be able to get to work at the employer. Obviously, a very convenient option. There is minimal, if not, there's basically no delay, right, between talking to the CBP officer and getting your stamp in your passport, and you can begin work immediately once that happens. The other option that they have is to apply at a consulate in Canada. So as you can imagine, because the port of entry option is so convenient, it is rare for Canadians to apply for a TN visa at a consulate. When it does happen, it is oftentimes because the Canadian national, the primary TN applicant, has a dependent, a spouse or a child who's not a citizen of Canada. So if you're a national of Canada, you're married to a national of China who's traveling on a Chinese passport. Let's say they've applied for their permanent resident status in Canada, but they haven't received it, then your spouse is going to need to apply at a consulate. And so in those cases, you do see the national of Canada also applying at a consulate because it's nice to go with your spouse, or if your child's in that situation, going with them. The third option that's available to Canadians is if they're already in the US, they can apply through USCIS. So let's take an example. Let's say a national of Canada is in the US as an F1 student. They've just finished school and they have spoken with an employer who wants to hire them. They can apply for what's called a change of status. So they would apply to change their status from F1 to TN through USCIS. And if they're approved, USCIS will send them an I-94, an approval notice with the I-94 on it that tells them that as of a certain date, they now have TN status. So that's the third option, is from within the US to apply to change their status to TN status. Nationals of Mexico can only take advantage of the latter two of those options. So nationals of Mexico must either apply for a TN visa at a consulate, or if they're already in the US, they would apply through USCIS for a change of status. They cannot apply at a port of entry. One side note on this, I actually had a discussion with someone this morning about this topic, so I do think it's important to clarify. The government actually has issued the law actually does say that nationals of Mexico can add or change an employer at the border. Okay, so that is in the regulations, but in practice, unfortunately, it is looking like Customs and Border Protection does not like to do that. For whatever reason, they do not like to approve a new employer or a change of employer for nationals of Mexico at the border who already have a valid visa. So I don't generally recommend that nationals of Mexico pursue that option because more often than not, it does seem these are resulting in denials. So the takeaway is really, if you are a national of Mexico, it's typically recommended to just apply at a consulate if you're outside the U.S. All right, so nationals of Mexico do have a benefit though, which is that as of the last, I think this actually happened in 2022, which was consulates now have the ability to give nationals of Mexico a TN visa for 4 years. So whereas nationals of Canada can only get TN status for up to 3 years, nationals of Mexico can get a 4-year visa, which is nice. You do have to pay an additional amount for that longer visa validity period, but it's typically worth it. And then both nationals of Mexico and Canada, when they enter the US, they're given TN status for a maximum of 3 years. Usually US employers will ask for, in their employer letter, they'll ask for a validity period of 3 years. There are cases, and we'll talk about one of those on the next slide, where it could be strategic to ask for a shorter period of time. And in those cases, Customs and Border Protection will typically grant status for less than 3 years. And for nationals of Mexico, as you see on your screen, sometimes if you're renewing the visa, you will be able to do so through mail. And the consulate, basically the way that works is you'll file your application with the consulate by submitting the DS-160 as you would any non-immigrant visa application. And then the consulate will review the application. And if they decide you're eligible for the by mail renewal, they'll let you know, and you'll be able to mail in your passport and get your new TN visa. But they will make that decision once they review the initial application. Let's talk about some difficult TN categories. So as you remember, we looked at the TN regulations and we saw there are literally dozens of TN occupations. They are not all created equal. Some occupations are more difficult to be approved for than others. And you see on your screen 2 of those categories that are particularly challenging to be approved for very different reasons. So the first category that's difficult to be approved for is the management consultant category. The reason this is a difficult category is because, as we discussed at the beginning of the presentation, you can qualify for this category based on experience alone. So if you don't have a college degree, you are going to be limited basically to this one category. Almost all of the other categories require either a degree or some kind of a professional license, which in and of itself will usually require a degree. Management consulting category, you can apply for based solely on experience. So people who want a TN visa, want the easiest way to come into the US to work, and don't have a diploma will oftentimes fall into the management consulting category as a catch-all. The government's aware of this, so they scrutinize management consultant applications. But let me pause there, because there really is a spectrum here. Not all management consultant applications are challenging. If you are applying for a TN visa to work for a management consulting firm in the US, a company like Bain, BCG, McKinsey, Oliver Wyman, there are many management consulting firms. Those applications are not particularly risky. Again, if you're coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm. What are risky is when you're coming to the US in the management consulting category to work for a company that is not a management consulting firm. I like to use the example of a company in the US that manufactures and sells solar panels. And they have struggled to improve the efficiencies of either their manufacturing, or they want to expand sales by breaking into a new market. And you have a lot of experience in this area. Let's say you've worked in Canada as an expert in solar panels for a decade, and this US solar panel company wants to hire you to come in and advise them on how to improve their efficiencies or expand their sales. That would be a risky application. Why? Because the US employer is not a management consulting company. It is a solar panel company. That being said, we have seen many such applications approved. Of course, we can't guarantee future results, but it is certainly possible to create a viable TN management consultant application to come to the US to work for a company that is not a management consulting firm. And it's an important category to be aware of, because US businesses do tend to benefit from people coming from Canada and Mexico to advise them on a specific problem they're facing. So how do you strengthen an application to make it more likely to be approved in this situation? So it's helpful to think about the realities of a company hiring a management consultant. So I'm going to keep referring to my solar panel example. I really like that example. I think it captures this well. If you're being hired as an expert on solar panels for this US solar panel company, what looks like a legitimate management consultant arrangement? Well, usually a management consultant comes into the US or comes to a company to advise on a very specific challenge, right? The company has defined a specific problem they're facing. We cannot break into a certain market. We can't sell to people in, Florida. We're struggling with that. Or our manufacturing process is too expensive. We are really struggling to bring down costs. So you want the TN application to talk about the specific challenge the company is facing that you are going to help them address. That's the first part. The second part is that you're qualified to address that challenge. So here's the challenge the company is facing. Based on my experience, I am uniquely qualified to address that challenge, or this employee is uniquely qualified. So a very specific problem where you are specifically qualified to address that challenge. Related to that is a finite timeline. So you're not coming into the US necessarily to work for a 3-year period. If the problem doesn't take 3 years to be solved, then maybe consider not requesting 3 years. So it can strengthen a management consultant TN application if you're saying, you know what, this specific problem probably is going to take a year to solve. So therefore, we're only asking for a year of TN status to address this problem. Similarly, management consultants are usually not put on payroll, right? They're not usually W-2 employees. If you hire McKinsey, you're probably not going to put the McKinsey consultant on your W-2 payroll to be a salaried employee. Rather, you're probably going to have some kind of a consulting agreement with them, a contract that defines the deliverables of what they're going to do. We're going to, in months 1 through 3, we're going to do this, and you're going to get this. In 3 through 6, you're going to see this. And you're going to be compensated for those things in this way. It could be hourly compensation, but it's probably not salaried. So similarly, it's good, probably good in your TN application to work with the employer to craft a consulting agreement. Here's what you're going to do for us. Here's how you're going to solve the challenge we've defined. And here's how we're going to pay you to do that. So oftentimes management consultant applications can be strengthened by being independent contractor arrangements rather than W-2 employee agreements. So the final point that you see on your screen, the government does scrutinize these to see whether the role is what they call supernumerary. What that means is you're not coming to the US to fill a permanent role at the company. So let's say our solar panel company, it's not like they have a permanent position for someone who is doing marketing and you're going to come in and fill that role. That is a risky thing to do. Instead, they are actually creating work for you to address a specific problem, as I've mentioned. Okay, so again, think about what the management consultant arrangement typically looks like and try to craft the TN application, again, in an honest way. Obviously, everything I'm saying assumes that the employer agrees with this representation and it is accurate and consistent with what you'll actually be doing in the US. So that's the management consulting category. The second challenging category we'll talk about is the economist category. So this category is challenging for a completely different reason, which is that in 2017, the government put out a policy memo that basically said, you know what, we are letting too many people into the US as TN economists who are not doing the job duties of economists. Instead, they are coming into the US basically to work as financial analysts and market research analysts. So we are going to explicitly say that if you are coming into the US to work as an economist, you cannot be coming into the US to work as a financial analyst or a market research analyst. So let's flesh that out a little bit more. What can you come into the US to do in the economist category? Well, it's helpful to go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So if we quickly search for that OOH economist, and we click that link and we click what they do, you see economists typically do the following. They research economic issues related to education, the labor force, international trade. They conduct surveys, they collect data, they analyze that data using mathematical models, statistics. They forecast and interpret trends. They advise businesses, governments, and they present their research. Okay. So, what do economists not do? Or let me reframe that by saying, what do financial analysts and market research analysts do that's different from what we just looked at? So, essentially, financial analysts are people defined by the government who find ways to create profit from investments. So financial analysts are looking for opportunities for companies to invest funds and generate a profit. So if you're working at a hedge fund, if you're working for an investment bank, and your job is to look for opportunities to invest money to create profit, you are probably going to have a hard time coming in the economist category. They're probably going to say, this job looks like a financial analyst, therefore we're going to deny it. Let me quickly say, job titles don't mean too much in the context of TN visas. What is much more important are your job duties. So you can put whatever job title you want in the TN application. The government is always going to read that job title, and then they're going to look at the job duties, and they're going to see if those job duties are consistent with the title. So that being said, I do think it's helpful for the job title to be aligned with the TN category, just because it reduces the questions. But what I'm trying to say is, don't think that the job title alone is going to cause the officer to not pay attention to the job duties. They will pay attention to the job duties. So we talked about financial analysts, those who try to generate profit from investments. Market research analysts are looking at how to market products, services, or the company. So again, I used this as an example before, how many people will try to come into the US on a TN to work as marketers. This policy change in 2017 made that especially difficult. If you're trying to do that, either work with an attorney to figure out if you can do that as a management consultant, or again, legitimately, you're going to have you have to present your job duties honestly and your role honestly. But there may be ways that what the company is struggling with is a marketing issue, and you as a management consultant are coming in to help them with that. That could be a very legitimate management consultant application. Or, at the end of the day, if it turns out that your job duties just don't align with a TN category, you may need to look for other visa options, such as the H-1B, the L visa, something like that. And we'd be happy to talk with you through that if that's the case. But just to quickly summarize, the economist category, if you have a degree in economics and you qualify for the category, and an employer's offered you a role, just make sure your job duties are consistent with what the OOH says an economist does, and that you are not coming to the US primarily to work as a financial analyst or a market research analyst, as the government defines those roles. So let's talk in more detail about the TN application process. I'm going to build on the previous slide we saw that talked about how nationals of Canada have 3 options to apply. Nationals of Mexico have 2 of those options to apply, the consular option and the USCIS option. Nationals of Canada can additionally apply at a port of entry. So what is a TN application? You see on the second slide that nationals of Canada would provide the job offer letter and supporting documentation that shows proof of citizenship, as well as their qualifications. So those are really the main pieces of a TN application. And I'll just quickly say, I know that this appears under Canadians, but the application package is really going to be more or less the same, whether you're applying at a consulate, a port of entry, or USCIS. I will talk about some slight differences between them, but any TN application is going to need a letter from the employer that talks about who the employer is, why they need someone in this position, who you are as the employee, why you're qualified for the position, again, qualified based on the TN regulations, and not just what the employer wants. Now, that being said, it is good, of course, for the employer to talk about why you're a great candidate for this role. So just to quickly kind of parse those out, it is good to be clear that, in the employer letter, that this employee qualifies for the TN visa based on, let's say, their baccalaureate degree. Okay, and make that clear. And separately, they're a great fit for our firm because they've been doing this work for 20 years. Okay. But it's important that the two not get confused. You're not qualifying for the TN visa based on your 20 years of experience. That's just something the employer likes. And the reason that's important to get clear is that border officers oftentimes do confuse them. So when you're in your interview and they start saying, they're talking about your 20 years of experience, but I don't think your experience is related, you need to be ready to explain to them, hold on, I'm qualifying based on my degree. I'm not qualifying based on my experience. And I know that's a little bit nuanced, but it is a very important distinction to make when you're applying for a TN. So let's get back to the package of what an application is. It's that job offer letter, and the job offer letter should also have details of how long they intend to employ you, again, up to 3 years, what you're going to be paid. And again, the job duties is really a key piece as well of that letter. You also do need to include proof of how you qualify. So if it's a diploma, you need to have, if you're applying at the port of entry, your original diploma. I know it sounds crazy, but you need to bring your original diploma with you. If your diploma is in a related field, so let's say you're applying to come to the US as an accountant, but your degree is in economics. That's a related field. So CBP, depending on the officer, depending on the port of entry, they will respond to this differently. Some officers will accept a related degree and say, okay, economics is similar to accounting, and therefore we approve your application, you qualify. There, however, is a very good chance that what the officer will say is, you don't have an accounting degree, you have an economics degree. Or if your degree is even more unrelated, you have a math degree, or you have a history degree, or you have an English degree. You see how we're getting farther and farther away from an accounting degree. As you get farther and farther away from a degree that's specifically in the profession, so accounting is the example I'm using, but the same is true of economics, the same is true if you're applying, in whatever field it is, you want to be prepared to explain how your degree is related to the job. So to take an example, continue with the example, an accountant who's applying with a math degree is going to want to bring their transcripts and is going to want to show, look, even though I have a degree in math, I took a bunch of classes in accounting. I took a bunch of classes in finance. Bring your transcript, certified copy if you're applying at the port of entry or at the consulate, and be ready to walk through the individual courses and show how your educational background qualifies for that role. Now, again, this is if you're qualifying based on your education. If you're qualifying based on experience, and the government, again, look at the regulations, but usually they want to see a letter from past employers that talks about how much time you spent working for them and that you were performing job duties consistent with that occupation. So that's documentation showing how you qualify. Again, how you qualify according to the regulations. You also you see on the second bullet, provide proof of citizenship. That's going to be your passport. So of course, you do want to travel with your passport. If you're going to the consulate, bring your passport. And that really is the bulk of what the TN application is. It's that employer letter, proof of how you qualify, and proof of citizenship. Now, if you're applying at the consulate, the application is going to include a DS-160. That's what you file before your interview. You do that online. That's going to go to the consulate, and then they'll allow you to schedule your interview after you do your biometrics, your fingerprints, etc. And if you're applying from within the US through USCIS, you're going to take that same application packet I talked about before, employer letter, proof of qualification, proof of citizenship. With USCIS, you will send copies. You will not send the originals. and you will submit them with an I-129 to USCIS. The I-129 is the form that's used to apply for TN status in the US. That form is going to be signed by the employer and technically will be filed by the employer. So that's an important difference. If you're applying with USCIS, the employer files the application. If you're applying at a port of entry or at a consulate, you as the employee file the application. So some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. You can find this online. So, look at if this is your first TN application, it's helpful to go to the CBP, Customs and Border Protection website, and find out which ports of entry are optimized for first-time applicants. I always do recommend that you call the port of entry ahead of time just to make sure they're open at the hours you plan to visit, and if they have any unique procedures. During COVID, some ports of entry had restricted hours or unusual rules. So it's always good to get into the habit of just calling ahead of time, making sure you're clear on what to do the day of. All right. I already touched on most of what remains on the screen, so I'm not going to go into much more detail. Nationals of Mexico apply to consulate with the DS-160, and then nationals of Canada or Mexico can apply for a change of status within the US through USCIS by the employer filing an I-129. All right, some tips and common pitfalls. I already mentioned this first one, call ahead at the port of entry. It never hurts to be clear on what the procedures are. Make sure that the employer contact who signed your letter is available for a call. This doesn't happen often, but it sometimes does happen where the border officer will pick up the phone and call the person who signed your employer letter just to make sure that the job is legitimate. So just give the employer a heads up, the person who signed the letter. It could be your human resources representative. It could be whoever it is, whoever's handling the process at the employer for you, and sign the letter. Just say, I'm planning to approach the border or be at the airport tomorrow between 3 and 5 p.m. Can you just have your phone on you in case they call? And it's better safe than sorry to ask them to do that. The third point you see on your screen, bring your diploma, official transcripts, and the original signed version of the employer letter. This is if you're applying at a consulate or the port of entry. The reason is that the government encounters a lot of fraud. So if you show up with copies of signatures, copies of diplomas or transcripts, there is a good chance they will reject the documents because of concerns with fraud. So I don't want you to waste your time. I would say always plan ahead by just bringing original documents. Have the employer mail you the original signed version of the employer letter before you go to the airport or to the land crossing or to the consulate. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. It's not a green card. So it is important that you be able to show when you're applying for the TN that you have the intention to leave the United States at the end of your status. Okay, so that being said, it is fine to renew a TN as long as you remain eligible. There's really no limit on the number of times you can renew the TN. You are probably not going to get questions about your ties to Canada or Mexico the first or second time you apply for a TN, but if you're renewing it a third, fourth time and you're going on 8 or 9 years on a TN, you will likely start to get questions about, do you actually intend to end up back in Mexico or Canada, or is your ultimate plan to stay in the US permanently? So it never hurts to bring documents showing your ties to your home country, whether that's copies of bank statements in those countries, proof that you own property there, things like that. It's always good to come prepared. And with that, I will pass it off to Hugues. I do know a question came in. I do want to make sure that we read it on the presentation for those tuning in. So Hugues, I'll go ahead and
Yeah, we got a question about education requirements for Canadian citizens. And the question is if someone has a college diploma in computer programming, can they apply for a TN visa? And if not, if they were to obtain a master's degree in computer science, would their application be approved? And I think that kind of ties into something you touched on, is choosing the right classification or the right category for the profit position in the US. And kind of working backwards from the position to the qualifications rather than the other way around. So I don't know if you want to discuss that a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely right, and it's a great question. So Hugues is exactly right. Basically, it's not a simple yes no answer. You first have to look at what is the job offer asking you to do. What will you actually be doing in the US? What occupation does that fit into? And then how do you qualify for that occupation? So let's assume that this is a job where you can qualify based on a diploma. You can qualify based on your degree. Then it's going to be a question of, is the degree in the specific field of the TN category? And if it's not, which it may not be in this example, then did you take courses that are related to the TN occupation? And again, as you get farther and farther away from the job you're coming to the US to do, you need to be more and more ready to make an argument that you actually do satisfy the educational requirement. And frankly, there does come a point where the connection is just too distanced. I used the example before, if you're applying as an accountant and your degree is in English, there is a very high likelihood you're going to be denied there. There's just not really a way around that. So you might need to look for alternatives. And I would say the same thing here. If your degree is in computer programming, but you're applying to come to the US, as a lawyer, that's going to be a very tough sell. But if the job is closely related to computer programming, definitely could be viable. Now, there's another question about, if you have a master's degree, if you have a more advanced degree, that is fine. If the TN regulations say you need a bachelor's degree in a certain field and you don't have a bachelor's degree, let's take the example of economists. Let's say your bachelor's degree is in English, which would not typically not be approved, but then you went to get a master's degree in economics. That is not a problem. You can apply based on your master's degree in economics. You satisfy the degree requirement based on a more advanced degree. I'll go ahead, since the question is somewhat related, and say that another very common question we get is, do I need an educational equivalency certification? And that's basically, let's say you got a degree in India and you're applying for a TN. Oftentimes you'll need to go to a third party. This is oftentimes a company that will look at your degree in India and will basically say it's equivalent to a certain degree in the US, whether that's a bachelor's degree, whatever it is. The answer is that you do not need an equivalency certification if your degree is from an institution in Canada, Mexico, or the United States. Okay, so if you got the degree in one of those three countries, Canada, Mexico, or the US, you do not need an equivalency certification. However, if your degree is from anywhere else in the world, you do need that equivalency certification. And again, this is only relevant if you're qualifying based on education. If you're qualifying based on experience, then don't worry about a diploma. You don't need a diploma. But if you're qualifying based on education, you need that equivalency certification if the degree is from outside Canada, Mexico, or the US. And so, some people are surprised to hear this. I have had clients who have advanced degrees from the London School of Economics. It does not matter. You need an equivalency certification from the London School of Economics or Oxford or any other school outside of North America, Mexico, Canada, or the US.
Thanks, Dustin. Just another question came up, and it's actually related. The question is, what about a cost estimating position? There is no actual bachelor's degree in estimating. So if I'm an engineer, is there any leeway?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'll preface it by saying that during webinars, we don't get into the specifics of your circumstances. We usually don't get into qualifying for specific positions. For that, a consultation is a much better fit, since we can have exactly the conversation you're asking about, where we'll get into, okay, what is your degree in? What classes have you taken? What experience do you have? And we'll be able to actually look at all the possible options that might be available to you. So with that being said, and if you think it would be helpful, do schedule a consultation. I would just say, at the end of the day, is there any leeway? I wouldn't call it leeway. What I would say is that it is good to be strategic about what is the position, how do the regulations require that I qualify, and what is the best argument I can make about how I qualify. If at the end of the day all you have is an engineering degree, but you took classes that are directly relevant to cost estimation, then make that argument. And since we're kind of leading to this topic by my answer there, oftentimes it's actually in US immigration, it is basically never possible to eliminate risk. And the reason for that is the immigration system in the US is largely based on discretion. And whether it's at a consulate, whether it's USCIS or at a port of entry, you really are hoping that an officer, a government employee, exercises their discretion, which is oftentimes their whim, in your favor. So you cannot eliminate that human aspect. Even if you have a risky TN application, it is sometimes helpful to think about, well, what does it look like if I present this application and I am denied? And I don't want to minimize the significance of a denial. A denial is significant. It does go into the government's computer system. You should assume the government's going to see that anytime you apply for a visa. Anytime you apply for an extension or a change of status with USCIS, they'll probably see that denial. Anytime you approach the border and fly into the country, they'll probably see that denial. But that being said, almost in most circumstances, you can apply again. So let's say you go to the border with a risky TN application, you answer questions honestly and accurately, and they decide you don't qualify. You can ask that the application be withdrawn, still probably going to be characterized as a denial, but then you can still apply again more often than not. You can think about what were the questions they asked, what were the criticisms they had, how might the employer be open to changing the job duties, to changing the position, or should I find a job with another employer? And then more often than not, you can apply again. So the risk of a denial while there is not enormous. It's not like you're going to be barred from applying again in most circumstances. I can't say always. Sometimes there are things people have done that do come up in interviews and do result in them having significant issues. But for the purposes of this presentation, there's generally not a huge downside to having an application denied, learning from it, applying again, and giving it your best shot a second time. All right, I think
that was it in terms of questions.
Perfect. Well, thank you all, Hugues. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for taking the time. The questions were great. As Hugues mentioned, we will be following up. The presentation was recorded, and we hope you will sign up for future webinars. And please don't hesitate to reach out for a consultation, to schedule a consultation if it would be helpful to do so. In the email we'll follow up with you with, there will be a link to the recording, so you will have access to that. We post our recordings on our YouTube channel, so do check out our channel when you have a chance. So Hugues, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.